As Anne said, my name is James Hayman. I write books. I write thrillers. However, to introduce myself, I have been a writer pretty much all my working life. I was born and pretty much raised in New York City, and my first job was as a copywriter in an advertising agency in New York City. And I spent close to 30 years writing and producing mostly television commercials for major advertising agencies, for big clients like the U.S. Army and Procter & Gamble and Lincoln, Mercury, and Ford, which was a lot of fun. I mean, it was a ball for anybody who wants to be a writer and make some pretty good money at it and have some fun, though I think it's probably not as much fun for you who are still in school and thinking about careers today as it was when I was in it, because the computer does so much of what we had to travel around the world to do. But I suspect it's still fun, and it is very good training for writing fiction. I don't know how many of you are interested in taking a crack at writing fiction, but as I say, after 25 plus years as a writer in the advertising business, I finally scratched the itch that I'd had for all those years, and had not scratched because I did have a mortgage to pay and kids to send to college, and therefore tuition to pay. But I moved to Portland and began thinking about writing books. If anybody wants to write novels, I heartily recommend you write the kind of novel you like to read, which is what I did. I was a thriller reader. I enjoyed reading. You may or may not know these names, but I enjoyed writers like Michael Connelly, who has a hero named Harry Bosch, whose real name is Hieronymus Bosch. I enjoy Ian Rankin, who writes wonderful books set in Edinburgh, Scotland, with a ne'er-do-well alcoholic cop named John Rebus. I read my fellow Mainer's books, Tess Gerritsen, who has a tough little fireplug of a Boston detective named Jane Rizzoli, who has been transformed through a new television series into Angie Harmon, which is physically quite a feat, but kind of interesting. And Tess was, I talked to Tess about it, so I do know her, and she was like, wow, Angie Harmon? And I have to, well, do I have to re-describe Jane Rizzoli? And the next book she decided, no, she didn't have to do that. The television people did what they wanted to do. But, so the first thing when you write fiction is to decide what kind of books you want to write. And naturally, as I said, I decided to write thrillers. The second question you have to ask yourself is not the plot. I always get the question of where do you dream up the plots? Second question is, who is your hero going to be? You're going to write a series. You're going to live with this hero for a very long time. And there are all kinds of heroes out there. There's the thriller hero is Superman. Most people are familiar with James Bond. He's certainly a Superman. Currently, a writer named Lee Child is one of the most successful thriller writers, and he's got a hero named Jack Reacher who certainly shares a lot of Superman qualities in that he can easily beat up 6 people with his fists simultaneously, all of whom outweigh him by 50 pounds. There are numbers of thriller heroes who are probably best known for ethnic diversity. There's the ladies' #1 detective agency, which takes place in Africa and has Madame, whose name I can't pronounce, so you'll forgive me. I've got it written down. Madame, where is she? Here she is. Madame Ramatsui from Botswana's #1 ladies detective agency. There are, of course, Tony Hillerman's books, which take place in New Mexico and really depend on the setting there and on the 2 Native American detectives, Lee Porn and She, who went on. Sadly, Tony Hillerman is no longer with us. There are also lots of books that choose their heroes by odd sort of occupations. Dick Francis made a very good career out of having jockeys who were detectives. Another writer has a rare bookseller who's a very successful detective. A name we all know, Dan Brown, turned somebody who was, and I have no idea what a person who is a symbolologist does for a living, but he had a Harvard symbolologist as his hero and made a ton of money on the Da Vinci Code. And maybe the most interesting, and I would guess maybe the best money maker of them all, is a young woman named Lisbeth Salander, who probably most of you are familiar with, who is the girl with the dragon tattoo, who also happens to be a brilliant antisocial computer hacker who gets into everybody's computers and largely solves her mystery by her ability to not be foiled by any computer on Earth. She can get into anything from the Pentagon on down. I decided not to do any of that stuff. I thought about all the different things that had already been done and decided that the only thing left would be a transgender Siberian dwarf, and I didn't want to go that route. So I picked the stereotype of all stereotypes. I picked an Irish cop with a drinking problem. He, like me, like his writer, they always say, write what you know. Michael McCabe, my hero, is a New Yorker. He was born in the Bronx. I was born in Brooklyn. He joined the police force. I went to work for an ad agency. But we share a lot of the same psychic likes and dislikes. We both like good Scotch whiskey. We're both, he has a girlfriend who's a terrific artist. I happen to have a wife who's a terrific artist. We think about a lot of the things in the same way. So that's not a bad way to choose a hero, somebody who shares things with you. He has a photographic memory, which I do not share. And as I say in a few notes in my biography on my website, he's a better shot than I am. He doesn't throw up at autopsies, and he's a hell of a lot braver in a lot of situations than I would be. Nonetheless, I chose McCabe as my hero. The next job any thriller writer has is to choose a setting. Well, I lived in a great setting that had not been used for a mystery series. Several standalones had been written with Portland backgrounds, but never a series. And Portland is, to me, almost the perfect background for a mystery series. It's a small, gritty little city, but it has an urban feel to it. It has great restaurants. It has a good art scene. I don't know how many of you really know Portland. And very importantly, it has a good-sized police force, 162 people with all the professional capabilities. They have a first-class police lab. They have just about every specialty that big city police departments have. So that problem was solved. So I began to write my first book, which was called The Cutting, and it introduced Detective McCabe. A year later, I published the second one, which is called The Chill of Night, and continues with Detective McCabe, Mike McCabe, and a bunch of other characters. And I would like to read you some excerpts from The Chill of Night, one in which comes at the beginning of the book, in which I introduce the victim, a beautiful young attorney named Lainey Goff, who unfortunately doesn't last beyond the first chapter, though her presence is felt for the rest of the book. I will introduce you to Detective McCabe as he discovers Lainey's body, and I will introduce you to a character who, I would say, is probably the most interesting character for a writer, for me as a writer, to have written. I'm a not young male writer. This character is a young female schizophrenic. And I wrote a good portion of this book in her voice, which was both challenging, sometimes frightening, and always, always fascinating. And so I will read a chapter, or part of a chapter, in the voice of this young woman whose name is Abby Quinn. But I'll start at the beginning of the book, as David Copperfield says, begin at the beginning, and introduce you to our victim. It's the Friday before a long Christmas weekend, Portland, Maine, Friday, December 23rd. And as I read, I do have a sort of croaky voice, so please raise your hand and wave furiously if it gets too low. Had number 10 Monument Square been set among the skyscrapers of New York, or even Boston, no one would have noticed it. In a town like Portland, it stood as one of the defining features of the skyline. 12 stories of reddish-brown granite with black windows set between vertical piers. Number 10 towered arrogantly over the east side of the square, a big player in a small town. At its top, large white letters proclaimed to anyone who cared to look that the building was the headquarters of Palmer Milliken, the city's largest and most prestigious law firm. It was also, according to Palmer Milliken's partners, one of the best anywhere in New England, including, they insisted, Boston. The firm's 192 lawyers, plus appropriate support staff, occupied all but 2 of the building's 12 floors. At 7:42 in the evening on the Friday before the long Christmas weekend, a young woman stood at the window of her modest office on the 7th floor, gazing down at the activity in the square. Elaine Elizabeth Goff, Laney to those who knew her well, was one of Palmer Milliken's senior associate attorneys. She'd already finished her work reviewing terms of a pending merger agreement between 2 small Maine banks. She'd pored over the documents half a dozen times, made a few changes, and sent in her recommendations an hour ago. Now she was ready to begin her winter vacation, a 2-week jaunt away from the bone-numbing cold of Portland to the small, elegant Bakuba Spa and Resort on the southwest side of Aruba. Only 2 last things remained: a FedEx envelope on her desk that needed to go out tonight, and a phone call that should have come 12 minutes ago. Its lateness was making her edgy. 6 years out of Cornell law, Laney was still in her 20s, though, as she recently and frequently began reminding herself, just barely. But even as the dreaded 30th approached, she took pride in her conviction that she, Laney Goff, the scholarship kid from Rockland, Maine, was about to become one of the youngest partners in Palmer Milliken's 57-year history. The offer, though not certain, was now so close she could almost taste it. She hoped word of the lucrative partnership would come tonight with the call she was waiting for, if only the damn phone would ring. She planned her life around that happening, began spending money she didn't have, the $500 Jimmy Choo shoes that were a torture to wear, the gleaming $40,000 BMW 325i convertible waiting in the garage downstairs. Not the bright red she really wanted, but the platinum bronze metallic she thought more lawyerly. And now the expensive vacation on Aruba. All that money ponied up in anticipation of greater rewards lying just around the corner. It wasn't that Laney was such an exceptional lawyer. Her intellectual and legal skills, while formidable, ranked her no higher than half a dozen others among Palmer Milliken's ambitious pack of associates. But in the race for the top, Laney enjoyed a key advantage not shared by any of her eager companions. She was not only an able lawyer, she was also an exceptionally beautiful woman. With shoulder-length dark hair, a slim athletic figure, and penetrating blue eyes that most people, but men in particular, found impossible to forget. And she was sleeping with her boss. Laney glanced at the old-fashioned electric sign atop the time and temperature building. 7:46, 4 minutes since the last time she looked. The temperature was 14 degrees, down 5 in the last hour. The cold that had gripped the city for the better part of the past 4 weeks was showing no signs of letting up. It was a good time to be taking off for the sunshine, a good time to celebrate, or would be if only Hank would get off his ass and call. Henry C. Hank Ogden, managing partner in charge of Palmer Milliken's lucrative M&A practice, her mentor, her boss, her lover, elegant, rich, 53 years old, and very, very married. Hank told her he'd call at 7:30. She didn't know why the call was late, but she didn't like it. The partnership meeting should have been over hours ago. She strummed her long nails on the sill in front of her. Maybe Hank was just stuck in another meeting. He'd call as soon as he got out. Maybe. That was the charitable assumption. The best of 3 possibilities. The second was that he was keeping her waiting just for the hell of it, to provoke a little extra anxiety. One of the power games Hank liked playing. His way of letting her know who was in charge, stupid and pointless, like a little boy poking a stick at a hamster in a cage. Well, she can handle his games. she told herself. She was tougher than that. The third possibility, the disaster scenario, was the one she wasn't sure she could handle, that in spite of Hank's promised sponsorship and strong support, the partners in their infinite wisdom had decided not to extend an offer. If that was the case, then Hank wasn't calling because he'd be nervous about her reaction. He hated scenes, public or private, and knew there'd be one. She took a deep breath. She'd give him 10 more minutes, then she would call him. She pushed fears about the partnership committee from her mind and decided to think instead about her upcoming vacation. Far more pleasant to think about that. 2 weeks of being pampered in the sunshine, 2 weeks to either celebrate her triumph or salve her pride, massages, facials, mud baths, hanging out on the beach by herself with a bunch of trashy paperbacks. Well, to be honest, not all by herself. She'd find someone to play with, someone with no connection to Maine or to Palmer Milliken. Someone European might be fun. Maybe she'd have a chance to practice her French. Patti LaBelle's rendition of Lady Marmalade riffed through her brain. Voulez-vous coucher avec moi ce soir? Voulez-vous coucher avec moi? And that is Lainey. Unfortunately for Lainey, she received neither the partnership nor did she make the vacation in Aruba. We next see her in the back of her own BMW, where we meet McCabe as he is about to discover her body, which has been in this in the trunk of the car for 4 days in these sub-freezing weather, and is frozen solid. You're all familiar with butterball turkeys. Lainey was more or less in the same condition. McCabe is just about to see the body for the first time. It's a dark night. It's on the Portland Fish Pier, for those of you who know Portland, but it's on the Portland waterfront. It's where the commercial fishing boats come in to unload their catches and where the sometimes fish auctions take place. It's an industrial commercial area, lonely and pretty empty at night. Finally, McCabe flicked off the light and stood up. He took a deep breath and walked toward the trunk. Preparing himself for the first few seconds he'd spend alone with the victim, the cop and the corpse. A unique and strangely intimate relationship, just the two of them. It didn't matter to McCabe who the victim was, a gangbanger or an innocent child. Either way, for him, it was this moment of shared intimacy that turned what was for some cops merely a job into an obligation, a sacred trust, to find and punish the killer, to right the wrong, to balance the scales. The Lord may someday get his turn, but for now, McCabe believed, vengeance is mine. I go first. In the dim light of the open trunk, the woman's frozen body shone back at him bluish white, her flesh waxen. She was on her side, head down, knees and arms curled in, like the tuck position divers squeeze into after they leap from their boards. Yet even in this position, there was something familiar about her. He flipped on the mag light and suddenly found himself looking at a body he knew better than his own. Sandy, his faithless bitch of an ex-wife, the one who'd walked out not only on their failed marriage, but also on their only child. How many times had he silently wished her dead? Now somehow she was. Dead, frozen, stuffed in a trunk. What in hell was she doing here? It made no sense. He moved the beam to the thick waves of dark hair covering her face. It was longer than he remembered, but he hadn't seen her for a while. He knew he shouldn't touch any part of her body, not even the hair, until Terry got here. Too bad. Jacoby had his pictures, and there was no way he wasn't going to look. He felt around in his pockets for the plastic ballpoint he was sure was there. Grasping it by one end, he slid it under her hair, wondering briefly if, like her limbs, the hair would be frozen stiff. It wasn't. He lifted it off her face, squatted down and shined the light in. Couldn't see much, but it was enough. The curve of her lip, the tilt of her nose, worst of all, one lifeless blue eye staring out, still mocking him even in death. "McCabe, are you all right?" It was Maggie's voice. He didn't answer, just raised his left hand and waved her off. The rational side of his brain told him the body couldn't be Sandy. But if not Sandy, who or what was it? Some kind of delusion brought on by what? Too much booze, too much emotion? Maybe he was going nuts. In his dreams, he'd seen her dead often enough. In some of those dreams, he even killed her himself, but always with a gun. Never like this, never without marks, never left her to freeze in the trunk of a car, not even a BMW, though, to be sure, Sandy would rather be found in a Beamer than a Ford. And finally, the third character that I think is very interesting in this book, perhaps the most interesting, Abby Quinn. Abby is 25 years old, schizophrenic. She's tried to commit suicide twice. When she is off her medication, she takes antipsychotic medication called Zyprexa, but she sometimes goes off her medication. And when she does, she hears voices and she sees things that aren't there, hallucinations, both audio and visual. But when we meet Abby, she's doing well. She's on her medication. She's working hard. She has a job as a waitress in a small restaurant on the island where she lives, which is part of the city of Portland and just a mile off the coast. And every night after she gets out of the restaurant, she jogs around the island because the medication she's on has a side effect of putting on weight. And to try to fight that, she exercises a lot, and her evening jog is a way to do that. She also does a circuit where she looks at the 13 summer cottages that she keeps an eye on for their rich owners who live somewhere else in the winter months. They come up for 2 months in the summer, and then they're off to wherever in the winter. And so she checks out the houses as she goes around and has keys to all of them. She has seen a light in one of the houses that should not be there. It's a flickering light, candlelight, maybe a lantern, she's not sure. Abby moved toward the house, trying to stay in the shadows like a TV detective. She had a feeling that whoever or whatever was inside, it wasn't Annie or Marie or any of the other island kids. And if not them, who? Her anxiety rose. She reached the house and climbed the 12 steps up to the porch. Then she pressed herself against the front of the house and crept sideways to the front door. She pushed her ear against the door and realized instantly how dumb that was. Between the blowing of the wind and the crashing of the waves against the rocks, there was no way in hell she'd hear anyone inside, even if they were screaming at the top of their lungs. But then she did. Someone talking quietly, then someone else. Then a chorus whispering. The voices were waking from their slumber. "Go on, stupid bitch, go inside. Go, you fat slug. Go inside and get yourself killed. That's what you really want, isn't it?" Ignore them, she told herself. Don't respond. Answering back just encourages them. She pushed herself forward. She had to do this. If she couldn't ignore the voices and do her job, she might just as well leap off the rocks. That's what the voices wanted her to do. This time they'd make sure there were no lobstermen around to fish her out. Abby felt wetness under the ski mask she was wearing and realized she was crying. The voices were getting louder. She had to shut them up. She pulled off her gloves and reached into her fanny pack and found her Zyprexa, pulled off the mask, and dry swallowed a 20-milligram tablet, her second of the day, twice what she was supposed to have. She didn't know how long it would take to work, or even if it would work, but she hoped it would. It was her only weapon. She put her mask and gloves back on and crept around to the back of the house. She peered in the window of the garage. There was more than enough moonlight to tell the car inside wasn't the Markham's Escalade. It was something smaller, something sleeker. Abby riffled through her keys until she found the one marked I am. She opened the back door and stepped inside. She closed it and listened again. She stood stock still. Moonlight poured through the big front windows. lighting the whole ground floor, which consisted of one big room, a kitchen area that led seamlessly into open dining and living spaces. Outside, foamy explosions of moonlit waves crashed into the rocks. The house was so solidly built, she could barely hear them. She didn't think the extra pill could have worked that fast, but the voices seemed quieter, reduced to a grousing and grumbling, like restless sleepers turning in their beds. Otherwise, there was silence. The room felt warm. Abby knelt down and placed a bare hand flat on the hardwood floor. The underfloor heating was on. She looked around for coats or boots or other signs of winter intruders. Nothing. To Abby's right, a staircase led up to the second floor, and whoever or whatever awaited her there. She stood by the bottom step and listened. From upstairs, she heard a long, low, mournful cry. Her heart beat faster. Was it the voices? She didn't think so, but she told them to shut up anyway. She stood for a minute, closed her eyes, and took a deep breath. If she could do this one thing, and do it right, maybe she could silence the voices forever. Besides, it was her job. She had to try. She looked around the kitchen for a possible weapon. She spotted a 9-inch chef's knife. Lethal, but the thought of actually stabbing anyone, even in self-defense, frightened her too much. She settled instead for a small cast-iron skillet. The notion of fracturing a skull was somehow more appealing. She took off her mittens, clipped them to her belt. She took another deep breath, waited a few seconds, then began to climb the stairs one by one, as silently as possible. She was clutching the skillet so tightly, her right hand began to hurt. She stepped onto the landing floor. A thick carpet muffled her steps. The wordless cry came again, soft and utterly without hope. It seemed to Abby the saddest sound she'd ever heard. Was it real, or was it the voices? She had no way of knowing. The door at the end of the dark hall was ajar. Dim, flickering light shone through an opening of 1 inch or maybe less. Abby pushed herself against the jamb and with one eye peered in. For a moment, she stood transfixed, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to comprehend the scene before her. The room was lit only by a few candles scattered around. A naked woman knelt on the bed, her wrists and ankles bound to the bedpost with what looked like silk scarves. Another scarf was tied around her mouth. Her head was down, dark hair hid her face. At the side of the bed, a man stood, facing the woman, his back to Abby. He too was naked, with a slender, muscular body. He held a thin-bladed knife in his right hand. As Abby watched, he lifted the woman's hand with his left hand, raised the knife with his right. Then he brought the knife downward in an arc. He stopped, positioned it carefully in the center of the woman's neck, then pushed. The blade penetrated flesh. The woman slumped. Abby's brain exploded in a cacophony of voices. She screamed. The man turned. He had no face, just a fiery mane with icy eyes peering at Abby through the flames. Shocked by Abby's scream, the man with the face of fire pulled the knife from the woman's neck, tore open the door, and slashed at Abby's throat. She leapt back. The blade missed. He raised his arm to strike again. Abby swung the skillet, missed. The voices screamed. Abby ran. The man, still naked, ran after her. Abby's head filled with horrible sounds, a chorus screaming for her death. She took the stairs 2 at a time and raced for the front door. It was locked. The man closed in. Abby swung the skillet and missed again. Flames flew from his bestial eyes. The voices laughed hysterically. Abby flipped the bolt. Death touched her arm, his hand burning like the devil's own. She turned, crouched, and swung the skillet in a low arc like the field hockey player she once was, going for a goal. This time it connected. He went down, choking, gasping for air, clutching his injured testicles. Abby spun and ran through the open door and down the steps, tossing the skillet into the shrubs at the side of the house. She raced across the frozen yard. Glancing back, she saw his naked form, charging down the porch stairs and out into the frozen night. She leapt the icy slope down onto the road. Her cleats somehow held on the slick surface. Looking back again, she saw him slip, feet flying out from under him, in a kind of circus pantomime, a naked clown with a head of fire slipping on a frozen banana. His momentum took him up into the air, then down again, hard on his back. He lay still. Abby ran off into the night. She ran blindly, certain he would follow, determined to outrun not just her own death, but also the voices shrieking inside her head. And that's Abby Quinn, or some of Abby Quinn. We get to know her a little bit more and a little bit better as the book goes on. I'm going to see if you guys have any questions that you'd like to ask, but I will say, as I did at the beginning, that Abby was the most interesting character that I've written in either of the two books, and the process of getting into the head not only of a young female, but a young female who was actively schizophrenic and who actively slipped back and forth between reality and hallucination was a challenge, but also a very interesting exercise, one that I'm not sure enjoyed is the right term, but I guess in a way I did enjoy writing her and creating her, and I like her very much as a character. Anyway, I have time for some questions. Anybody who has anything they'd like to ask? Yes, sir.
Just keeping on with Abby, what inspired you to create her?
Actually, I read a fascinating book. Two things. When I start dreaming up plots, my plots sort of start with what I call a what if. And the what if in this instance was, what if somebody witnessed a murder, as Abby has just done, ran to the police, as she's about to do, and nobody believed her because they know who she is, they know her history, they know her hallucinations. It was an interesting what if, and I sort of built the story out from there, invented the victim after I had dreamed up Abby. The second thing was a book that I'd read, and I went on to read a number of others, but it was a book called The Center Cannot Hold, which I recommend to anyone who has any interest in schizophrenia or the experience of schizophrenia. It's written by a brilliant woman named Ellen Sachs, who teaches at Southern California Law School, but who is schizophrenic and has been battling schizophrenia since she was a late teenager, 18, 19 years old. But in spite of her illness, managed to become valedictorian of her class at Vanderbilt University, win a Marshall Fellowship to Oxford, and finish close to the top of her class at Yale Law School, all the while spending approximately 50% of her time in various mental hospitals, tied down and taking heavy drugs. Her memoir truly gives one a sense of what it is like to experience this dreadful illness. I then went on to read a number of other memoirs written by schizophrenics who have experienced it, and until I felt I had gathered enough to really get the voice, and that was the biggest challenge, getting the voice right. And I think I did. I think I did a good job of it. Not immodestly, he said. Any other questions? Yes?
Are you working on the third one?
I am working on a third one, and it's going to be, you've read both of them now, I believe, Anne. It's going to be a slightly different turn. The first two are both murders that take place in and around the city of Portland. The third book has scenes that take place in Portland, but the bulk of the action will take place way down east in Washington County, Maine, just outside of a town called Machias. Washington County is the poorest county in Maine, one of the least populated given the square mileage of it, and was also the place where one of my two heroes, Maggie Savage, was born. And she goes back because a good friend of hers gets into trouble there, and I won't tell you anymore, but she goes back to help a friend.
When does it due out?
As soon as I finish writing it, we can work on that.
I wasn't sure if you finished it.
No, I'm about 100 pages into it, so I have a fair way to go yet. Manuscript form, these books tend to run about 400 and some pages, so I'm about a quarter of the way through with it. Anyone else? Sir?
Do you write every day, or
Yeah, I think the most if any of you harbor ideas or dreams of becoming a writer, that's the single most important thing is sticking with it. I get up fairly early every morning, usually between 6 and 6:30, make myself some coffee, and I have a room in the house that is for nothing else. There is nothing in the room except a large easy chair, a bunch of bookcases, my laptop computer, and me. And my wife knows that if she has to knock on the door, I will grumpily answer, but she generally doesn't do that unless the house is on fire or we're facing some other dire emergency. So, and I'm in there it's probably start between 6:30 and 7, and I keep going. Depends how well it's moving. Usually stop anywhere from 11 to noon. I have on occasion when it's flowing very quickly and easily have gone for most of the day with just a few breaks. But,
So you don't have a page limit that you want to get done. About how many pages do you think you can do a day?
I don't do it that way because what I do is I keep going back and changing things. There are two ways of writing novels. There's the outline way, which a lot of writers do, and there is what is called organic writing. And I discovered early on that I was lousy at doing outlines and even lousier at following them. I did an outline for the cutting and I abandoned it literally on page 3. And after that, it was pretty much useless. So I don't write from an outline. I have a general notion of who the bad guy is, how the murder is committed. There's always a murder, of course. And how they go about finding the bad guy. But that's about the extent of my planning. So every time I change something, I have to go back and fix it. I'm also, probably to a fault, my own tightest editor. I'm always editing what I write, so I'm always going back and editing it, to the point that when I sent the cutting to St. Martin's Press in New York, my editor down there, Charlie Spicer, sent back his comments, and they literally took about 2 hours to accommodate. I mean, the book was very polished when he got it. Second book, he asked me to change the ending because he quite rightly recognized that I'd rushed the ending, and it was boring and dopey, and I shouldn't have written it that way, and he said rewrite it, and I did, and it was much better. So.
Do you discuss it, what's going on with the book with your wife, and if you do you take her advice? Or do you...
I take her advice when I think it's good advice. When I think it's lousy advice, I ignore it. I think that's pretty much what most people do. She has made some very good comments about both books. She's reads very quickly, and so she goes through 3 books to my 1. I mean, she's a much faster reader than I am, and she spends more time reading than I do. I spend more time writing, but be that as it may. So she's a good judge. She understands thrillers. She knows the formats. She told me the opening of my 3rd book was really boring, and I had to do something exciting at the beginning to hook the reader. And she was absolutely right. It was boring. It was mostly background stuff. And so, yes, I do take her advice.
I have one more question.
Please.
Between the time you started writing, when you first decided you were going to write thrillers, and now, how do you do it mechanically, and has anything electronically changed the way you write?
Do you mean, do I write with a pen or a computer, that sort of mechanically? Is that your point? I write with a laptop computer. I don't like sitting at desks. I like sitting in easy chairs. I'm inveterately lazy that way. I find them much more comfortable. Couldn't imagine writing a book with a pen. I know people do it. God knows Jane Austen did it very successfully. But I love moving chunks of copy around, and the computer is a dream. I mean, it makes it so easy to do that. And the other thing that a computer offers is instant information. If I don't know what a model of a car looks like or whatnot, I can instantly find out on Google. Google is a great research tool. I do use various experts in various fields who I email or talk to on a regular basis, but Google is always the first stop in any questions that I have. Yes?
That sort of leads into my question. I was thinking about plays play such an important part, obviously, in what you've read to us. So are you out, do you make yourself go and like look at the waterfront so you can describe it, or
Yes.
island?
Yeah. One of the reasons, aside from the fact that it was a great place to set a series, one of the reasons I set it in Portland is I'm there. The body, as I said, is found out on the Portland Fish Pier. I had never been out on the Portland Fish Pier, so I first Googled the Portland Fish Pier, discovered all I could in terms of newspaper articles and background information about the auction market that has been there for many years and is now about to die, unfortunately, because the fishing industry is in such bad shape. Then I drove out to the end of the pier. I placed the car where I wanted it. I looked around. I checked where the parking was. There is a scene that takes place in a small office building that is at the end of the pier. There is such an office building there. There is reference to a place called Vessel Services that provides fuel and water and other supplies to the fishing boats that come in. That is, in fact, there. It's a real company. So when I can, I do go and visit. I've spent some time up in Washington County where I'd never really been before, talking to people and just driving around and looking at the place. So, anyone else? Yes.
I'm sorry.
Don't be sorry.
Have you ever backed yourself into a corner while you were writing? I once got a question at the reference desk from somebody who wanted to know the part of a Russian machine gun that he could take to prove that he had the machine gun.
Did you find the answer for him?
Yeah, it was in the Great Soviet Encyclopedia. But do you ever, does that ever happen to you where you have a problem that you ran, like painting yourself into a corner?
Well, I don't know that I call it painting myself into a corner. One of the more interesting research problems that I had, Laney's body, as you heard, is found frozen. Question was, how do you autopsy a frozen corpse? Well, the first step was to go to Google and write in, how do you autopsy a frozen corpse? There were surprisingly, a few answers to that, one of which was an article written by a woman named Erin Presnell, who was a professor of forensic pathology at the University of South Carolina Medical School, who had written an article. I don't remember if this is the exact title, but it was something like that, How Do You Autopsy a Frozen Corpse? The article was not available online, but Erin's email was available. So I emailed her, asked her to send me, if she'd mind sending me, a copy of the article, and oh, by the way, would you mind terribly if I emailed you on a regular basis to ask you questions about various aspects of forensic pathology? And she was delighted and has been a huge help to me. We've become, email pen pals. And and I have several other, number of cops who are that way as well that I regularly ask questions of. I do pretty well. How do you autopsy frozen? You have to let it thaw. It takes a week. You cannot start until the entire body, outside and inside, is thawed and melted. They put it in a refrigerated room in Maine. It's at the Maine State Medical Examiner's office at a constant 38 degrees until it's completely thawed. And one of my cop heroines, Maggie, asked the medical examiner, well, can't we just dump it in a bath of water? Wouldn't that melt it faster? And the answer was that, yes, it would for the surface of the body, but the internal organs would remain frozen, and parts would decompose at different rates and would ruin a lot of the tests they had to do. So anyway, that's how you do it.
Timely information at Thanksgiving.
Yes, right.
Indeed. Indeed. Yes, ma'am.
Did you witness an autopsy as your...
Thank God, no. But I did go up to the medical examiner's office in Maine. I had a tour there. Went to the room where they did it, saw the table where they did it, know where the blood goes through the holes and down the drains. I would throw up at an autopsy. I mean, I don't consider myself super squeamish, but that's pretty hairy. If you've ever read the procedure, it takes a strong stomach.
Well, it's amazing because you make it sound like you had been, and that's what I had.
That's, I guess,
Good writing.
good writing. Thank you. Well, if there are no more questions, I thank you very much for coming. I enjoyed chatting. I always love talking about my own writing, about my own work, and I hope you enjoyed listening to it. Thank you.